1. The Macedonian Empire in history. The Macedonian Empire, though short-lived, remains one of the most captivating stories in the annals of history. For centuries, it influenced not only the world of its time, but also shaped the course of future civilizations. Its rapid expansion, its bold military strategies, and its dazzling leader, Alexander the Great, have cemented it as one of the most powerful empires the world has ever seen. But like so many empires before and after it, the Macedonian Empire rose to great heights and then collapsed just as swiftly. In this journey, we'll explore the origins, rise, golden age, and eventual decline of the Macedonian Empire, examining the key moments and players that contributed to its epic story. The Macedonian Empire was unique not only in its territorial reach, but in its cultural and military impact. The empire emerged in a small, remote kingdom in the north of Greece, hardly a superpower at first glance. Yet within a few decades, it conquered the known world, stretching from the ancient city-states of Greece to Egypt, Persia, and even into India. This was an empire that transcended borders, leaving behind a cultural legacy that would last for centuries, influencing everything from politics to philosophy to art. At the heart of this incredible rise was one man, Alexander the Great. His ambitions, vision, and military genius turned Macedonia from a kingdom on the fringes of ancient Greece into a global empire. But the story of Macedonia is not only about the glory of Alexander's conquests. It's also about the skilled leadership of his father, King Philip II, who set the stage for his son's incredible journey. The Macedonian Empire, though extraordinary in its scope and ambition, was not meant to last. The absence of a strong leadership after Alexander's untimely death led to the empire's collapse, as his generals fought each other for control of the vast territories. The once unified empire shattered into smaller kingdoms, and Macedonia itself would eventually fall under Roman control. Today, we explore the history of the Macedonian Empire from its modest beginnings to its remarkable rise, its golden age under Alexander, and its eventual disintegration. Along the way, we'll examine the political, military, and cultural factors that define this empire and how it left a lasting imprint on the world long after its fall. 2. Origins of the Macedonian Kingdom, 8th–5th century BCE. The story of the Macedonian Empire begins in the rugged hills of northern Greece, in a small and often overlooked kingdom called Macedon. In the 8th and 7th centuries, BCE, Macedon was far from the mighty empire it would eventually become. It was a relatively obscure region compared to the thriving city-states to the south like Athens and Sparta. The people of Macedon spoke a Greek dialect, but were considered somewhat distant from the more powerful Greek states. The Macedonian kingdom, at its early stages, lacked the cultural prestige and political influence that Athens and other city-states boasted. However, it was precisely these geographic and political circumstances that set the stage for its rise. The first real roots of the Macedonian kingdom trace back to the 8th century BCE with the establishment of the royal Argead dynasty. The Argeads, named after their founder, King Perdiccas, ruled Macedonia for several centuries. During this early period, Macedonia was essentially a tribal society, often struggling against invaders and neighboring peoples. Yet despite these challenges, the kingdom slowly grew stronger through a combination of military conquests and political alliances. The real shift toward power began in the 6th century BCE under King Amyntas III. Amyntas successfully united the scattered tribes of Macedonia and built a stronger political and military foundation. While his kingdom was still small and under the influence of larger Greek powers, he secured alliances with the influential city-states of the time. Amyntas. I set the tone for Macedonian kingship, one of strategic diplomacy and military preparation, necessary for survival in a region dominated by more established Greek powers. But it wasn't until the 5th century BCE, during the reign of King Amyntas II and his successors, that Macedonia began to take its first steps toward becoming a significant player in Greek politics. During this period, Macedon became increasingly involved in the politics of southern Greece. Though still a relatively small kingdom, Macedonia began to assert itself in the context of the Greek world, which was by now embroiled in the epic conflict of the Persian Wars. The Persians under King Xerxes had begun to pose a threat to Greece as a whole, leading the Greek city-states to unite against a common enemy. Macedonia, still a relatively weak kingdom at the time, supported the Greek coalition during the Persian invasion. However, despite the shared struggle, Macedonia was not considered a significant power by its Greek counterparts. In fact, the Macedonians were viewed as outsiders, rustic and distant from the glory of the great city-states like Athens and Sparta. During these early years, Macedon was still a land of rough terrain, with its mountainous landscape making it difficult to forge the kind of unified and powerful empire seen in Athens or Sparta. But what Macedonia lacked in influence, it made up for in a hardy and disciplined people. The very challenges of its geography, its remote position on the edge of Greek civilization, fostered a society that valued resilience, military strength, and pragmatic alliances. These characteristics would prove crucial in the kingdom's rise, even as Macedon remained relatively modest compared to the likes of Athens or Sparta. By the end of the 5th century BCE, however, everything began to change. Macedon was no longer content to be a small player on the fringe of the Greek world. Instead, its leaders were beginning to think beyond simple survival and local dominance. It was during the reign of King Philip II, the father of Alexander the Great, that Macedon would finally begin to make the transition from a small, isolated kingdom to one of the most powerful forces in the ancient world. The seeds for this transformation were planted long before Philip ascended to the throne, however. The early years of the Macedonian kingdom, its struggles and incremental steps toward greater unity, set the stage for the explosive rise that would follow. The groundwork for the military innovations, political alliances, and cultural blending that defined the Macedonian Empire had been laid. But it would be Philip II who truly harnessed these elements and propelled Macedonia to unprecedented power. 3. King Philip II, the architect of Macedonian power. 359–336 BCE. King Philip II is often credited as the true architect of the Macedonian Empire. His reign, lasting from 359 to 336 BCE, marks the turning point in Macedonian history. Before Philip, Macedon was a relatively inconspicuous kingdom, struggling to assert itself against the mighty Greek city-states to the south. But Philip's genius in both military strategy and political maneuvering transformed his kingdom into the most formidable power in Greece, setting the stage for the conquests of his son Alexander the Great. When Philip II inherited the throne in 359 BCE, Macedonia was on the brink of collapse. The kingdom was embroiled in internal struggles, and it faced external threats from neighboring Illyrians and Thracians. However, Philip, who was just 23 years old at the time, demonstrated an exceptional understanding of both warfare and statecraft. His first task was to secure the borders of his kingdom, and he did so with remarkable efficiency. Philip's military reforms were nothing short of revolutionary. He introduced the Macedonian phalanx, a formation that would become one of the most iconic aspects of ancient warfare. This new system of fighting was based on heavily armed infantry armed with long spears called sarissas that were up to 18 feet in length. This gave Macedonian soldiers a significant reach advantage over their opponents, allowing them to engage in battles at a greater distance and with more force than traditional Greek hoplites. Along with the phalanx, Philip made extensive use of cavalry, which played a crucial role in the army's mobility and effectiveness. The combination of infantry and cavalry created a flexible and efficient fighting force that could dominate on the battlefield. But Philip's military success wasn't solely due to his innovations in battle tactics. He also understood the importance of training and discipline. Macedonian soldiers were well-trained, highly organized, and under Philip's leadership, they were prepared to take on the best armies of the Greek world. Philip also introduced a new form of diplomacy, using marriage alliances and strategic marriages to secure peace with powerful neighbors and ensure Macedon's stability. His political acumen allowed him to build alliances with other Greek city-states and even play them against each other, all while steadily increasing his kingdom's power. One of Philip's most significant achievements was his conquest of northern Greece. In 357 BCE, he began his military campaigns against the Greek city-states of Thrace and Paeonia, expanding Macedonian territory. By 354 BCE, Philip had already secured his position as one of the most powerful rulers in the region, having eliminated many of the threats surrounding Macedonia. In the following years, he would turn his attention south, where he aimed to bring the powerful Greek city-states of Athens, Sparta, and Thebes under Macedonian control. By 338 BCE, after years of careful military and diplomatic maneuvering, Philip achieved a decisive victory at the Battle of Chaeronea, where his forces decisively defeated a combined army of Athens and Thebes. The battle marked the beginning of Macedonian dominance in Greece. Following this victory, Philip founded the Corinthian League, a political and military alliance of Greek states under Macedonian leadership. This alliance gave Philip control over the majority of Greece, and it provided him with a platform to expand his influence further. The League also signaled the end of the independent city-state system that had defined Greek politics for centuries. Philip's conquests extended beyond Greece, as he had ambitions of turning Macedonia into a powerful empire that could challenge the Persian Empire. He began preparations for a military campaign against Persia, hoping to fulfill a dream of revenge for the Greek city-states that had fallen to Persian invasion years earlier. However, before he could carry out this ambitious plan, tragedy struck. In 336 BCE, Philip was assassinated by a bodyguard at a wedding feast, leaving his son Alexander to inherit the throne. While Philip's death was abrupt, his legacy was clear. He had transformed Macedonia from a relatively obscure kingdom into the most powerful force in Greece. His military innovations, political alliances, and strategic conquests laid the foundation for the expansion of the Macedonian Empire. Without Philip, Alexander's subsequent conquests would have been unimaginable. The stage was set for the next great chapter in Macedonian history. 4. The formation of the Macedonian military machine. When Alexander the Great inherited his father, Philip II's kingdom in 336 BCE, he didn't just inherit a throne, he inherited a powerful, well-equipped military machine. The Macedonian army that Alexander commanded was unlike any that had existed before, and it played a crucial role in his success. The formation, organization, and sheer power of the Macedonian military were the foundations of the empire he would go on to build, stretching from Greece to Egypt and deep into the heart of Asia. Philip II had spent years building the army into a formidable force, but it was under Alexander's command that it reached its full potential. The core of the Macedonian military was the phalanx, a formation of infantry, armed with the sarissa, a long spear that could extend up to 18 feet. The phalanx was designed to hold a line and advance slowly but steadily, making it nearly impenetrable to traditional enemy formations. The men within the phalanx were highly disciplined and tightly packed, creating a wall of spears that could thrust forward in perfect unison. Alexander's genius lay in his ability to adapt and refine his father's military innovations. Under Philip, The phalanx had already proven effective, but Alexander took it to new heights by combining it with the use of cavalry. While the phalanx was an immovable force on the ground, the cavalry allowed for the flexibility to strike at crucial moments, exploit weaknesses in enemy lines, and deliver decisive blows. The companion cavalry led by Alexander himself was his personal strike force. These highly skilled horsemen were used in tandem with the infantry, striking fast and hard where the enemy was most vulnerable. The cavalry's importance was emphasized during key battles like Gaugamela, where Alexander used his cavalry to outflank the much larger Persian forces, turning the tide in his favor. But it wasn't just about cavalry and phalanx formations. Alexander knew the importance of keeping his soldiers motivated, trained, and well-equipped. His army's success was also due to their discipline and training, as they were taught not only to fight, but to think strategically. One of the most remarkable aspects of Alexander's military machine was the siege tactics it employed. The siege of Tyre, one of the most impressive of Alexander's campaigns, demonstrated the ingenuity and determination of the Macedonian army. Tyre, an island city off the coast of Phoenicia, was protected by massive walls that seemed invulnerable. Rather than retreating or besieging the city from a distance, Alexander ordered his men to build a massive causeway, a land bridge connecting the island to the mainland. Over the course of months, this ingenious construction allowed Alexander's army to assault the walls with battering rams and siege towers, ultimately leading to the city's fall. Beyond the army, Alexander was a master at organizing his logistical support system. His soldiers had access to food supplies and reinforcements that ensured they could stay on the move without becoming bogged down. The supply lines were essential for his success, as they allowed the Macedonian army to push into territories as far as India without the constant risk of starvation or lack of resources. Alexander's ability to maintain the morale of his army was key. Despite long campaigns and the weariness of war, his soldiers remained fiercely loyal to him, driven by his charisma and his unrelenting ambition. The engineering feats carried out by the Macedonian army were just as impressive as their military prowess. The construction of bridges, roads, and fortified camps allowed Alexander to outmaneuver enemies who were unfamiliar with such logistical capabilities. The Macedonian army was not just an army of soldiers. It was a well-oiled war machine combining brute force with strategy and tactics in ways that had never been seen before. But the military machine was not just about innovative tactics. It was also about the socio-political system Alexander created within his army. He implemented a policy of integration between the Macedonian and local populations in conquered territories, bringing together Greek and non-Greek soldiers in an effort to create unity within the empire. This blending of cultures, though controversial at times, became a hallmark of Alexander's rule. Macedonian soldiers fought alongside Persian troops, Egyptian forces, and local soldiers from regions such as India, creating an empire that was not solely Macedonian, but truly multicultural. The Macedonian army was also a product of the deep loyalty that Alexander inspired in his men. He shared in their hardships, fought alongside them in battle, and in many cases led from the front. His leadership style, coupled with his tactical brilliance, meant that his men trusted him implicitly. This trust was critical as Alexander pushed his army further and further east into unknown lands and unfamiliar terrains. The formation of the Macedonian military machine, its infantry cavalry siege tactics, and logistical support was a carefully crafted system that propelled Alexander to achieve extraordinary victories. This army was the backbone of his empire, and it was a reflection of the strategic and visionary leadership that he inherited from his father, Philip II, and perfected in his own time. But the Macedonian army was not just about war. It was about the creation of an empire, an empire that would stretch across continents, bringing together East and West under a single ruler. 5. The rise of Alexander the Great, 336–334 BCE. The year 336 BCE marked a pivotal moment in history, the assassination of King Philip II of Macedon. In the wake of his father's death, Alexander, still in his early 20s, ascended to the throne. At first glance, many would have doubted his ability to carry on his father's legacy. He was young, untested in battle, and inherited a kingdom that, despite its military power, was still fragile. Yet it didn't take long for Alexander to prove himself as one of the most brilliant and ambitious leaders the world has ever known. Alexander's reign began under grim circumstances. Philip's assassination left many questions unanswered, and Alexander faced immediate challenges both from within and outside the kingdom. Many in Macedonia were uncertain about the new king's abilities, and some viewed him as a usurper. To secure his throne, Alexander quickly eliminated rivals within his own court, consolidating his power and demonstrating that he would not hesitate to act decisively. But it was not just political maneuvering that marked Alexander's rise. His first act as king was to prove himself in battle. Before even settling the internal matters of his kingdom, he launched an expedition to crush a rebellious Greek city-state, Thebes. The Thebans had defied Macedonian authority, and Alexander responded with brutal efficiency. The city was sacked, and its inhabitants either slaughtered or sold into slavery. This act sent a clear message to the Greek world: Macedon under Alexander was not to be trifled with. With the Greek states subdued, Alexander turned his gaze southward. His father, Philip II, had been preparing for an invasion of the Persian Empire, a plan that would dominate the first years of Alexander's reign. The Persian Empire, led by the weak and ineffective King Darius III, was a colossal power stretching from the Aegean Sea to the Indian subcontinent. However, it was also a vast empire with an overextended military and a crumbling internal structure, providing a unique opportunity for Alexander to strike. Before launching his invasion, Alexander sought to unify the Greek states under his banner. In 337 BCE, he formed the Corinthian League, a coalition of Greek city-states that pledged their allegiance to Macedonia. This alliance, forged by both diplomacy and force, was critical to Alexander's ambitions. The Corinthian League gave him the political legitimacy to act as the leader of all Greek states and laid the groundwork for his invasion of Persia. In the spring of 334 BCE, Alexander crossed the Hellespont and entered Asia Minor, marking the beginning of his campaign against the Persian Empire. His army was small by comparison to the forces of the Persian Empire, but it was well-trained, well-equipped, and led by a commander who inspired unwavering loyalty. Alexander's strategy was clear: use, speed, surprise, and superior tactics to strike quickly before the Persian army could mobilize fully. As he moved through Asia Minor, Alexander quickly won a series of key battles, each victory boosting his reputation and solidifying his position as a leader of unparalleled military brilliance. His first major victory came at the Battle of the Granicus in 334 BCE. Despite being outnumbered, Alexander's forces decisively defeated the Persian army, securing a foothold in Asia Minor. The victory at the Granicus was not just a military triumph, it was a statement of Alexander's ability to lead and win against overwhelming odds. It also marked the beginning of his relentless march eastward, a journey that would take him across the Persian Empire and into the heart of Central Asia. The success of his campaign was based not only on Alexander's military genius, but also on his ability to inspire those around him. His soldiers were fiercely loyal, willing to follow him into battle even when faced with daunting odds. Alexander's leadership was characterized by his personal involvement in battles, where he was often seen fighting at the front lines alongside his men. This presence in battle solidified his bond with his army, fostering a sense of trust and camaraderie that was critical to his success. However, Alexander was not just a warrior, he was also a brilliant strategist and diplomat. As he moved deeper into Persian territory, he knew that simply defeating the Persian armies was not enough to ensure his success. He needed to win the hearts and minds of the people in the regions he conquered. Alexander's policy was one of cultural integration, blending Greek and Persian cultures to create a sense of unity within his empire. This approach would prove essential in maintaining control over the vast territories he was acquiring. Alexander's rise from a young and uncertain king to the leader of one of history's greatest empires is a testament to his vision, ambition, and military genius. His early years on the throne were marked by political consolidation, military victories, and the careful construction of alliances that set the stage for his later conquests. By 334 BCE, Alexander had already proven himself as one of history's greatest commanders, and the Persian Empire, the mightiest power of the ancient world, was now within his grasp. 6. The Persian Empire, the foe that ignited Macedonian ambitions. The Persian Empire, ruled by the Achaemenid dynasty, was at its height, one of the largest and most powerful empires the world had ever seen. Stretching from the Mediterranean Sea in the west to the Indus River in the east, the Persian Empire had a vast and diverse territory, encompassing much of the ancient world. It was a global power unrivaled in its size and reach, with a sophisticated bureaucracy, a well-established military, and immense wealth derived from its vast lands and resources. However, by the time Alexander the Great set his sights on the Persian Empire, the once mighty empire was beginning to show cracks. The reign of King Darius III, who ascended to the throne in 336 BCE, was marked by weakness and instability. Darius III inherited a powerful empire, but he lacked the political acumen, military genius, and vision of his predecessors. His reign was defined by a series of internal struggles, economic difficulties, and external threats, which ultimately left the Persian Empire vulnerable to invasion. The Persian military, once feared and respected across the ancient world, had become bloated and inefficient. While it had vast numbers of soldiers, it was poorly coordinated and often undermined by infighting among the ruling elites. Darius III's attempts to hold the empire together were thwarted by revolts in Egypt, Persia's western provinces, and growing unrest among his subject peoples. The Persian Empire, despite its immense size, was a collection of diverse cultures and peoples with little cohesion, making it difficult to maintain control over such a vast territory. For the Greeks, particularly the Macedonians, the Persian Empire represented both a mighty foe and an irresistible target. The Greek city-states, especially Athens and Sparta, had long resisted Persian domination, and the Persian Wars of the 5th century BCE, in which Greek forces had successfully repelled Persian invasions, had solidified the Greeks' disdain for Persia. Alexander, inheriting the ambitions of his father, King Philip II, viewed the Persian Empire not only as a rival power, but as the natural goal of his own conquests. In addition to the political and military challenges facing Darius III, the Persian Empire was also financially overstretched. The massive costs of maintaining such a vast empire strained the resources of the Persian state. The royal treasury was often depleted, and the central government struggled to raise sufficient funds to maintain the army. Meanwhile, Alexander's Macedonian forces, though numerically smaller, were well coordinated, highly motivated, and supported by a superior logistical system. Alexander's ambition to invade Persia was not simply about military conquest. It was deeply personal for him. His desire to avenge the Persian invasion of Greece during the reign of Xerxes the Phaeton, which had led to the burning of Athens in 480 BCE, was a key driving factor behind his campaigns. For Alexander, defeating Persia would be a form of retribution and a way to restore Greek honor. To Alexander, Persia represented the ultimate challenge. He saw himself not just as a conqueror, but as a liberator bringing the Greek spirit to a vast and powerful empire. His campaign against Persia was not just a military endeavor, but a cultural mission. By bringing Greek culture and ideas to the eastern lands, he hoped to create a new world order, one that blended East and West. As Alexander marched eastward, the Persian Empire scrambled to respond. Darius III, despite his vast resources, was unable to organize an effective defense. His military commanders were often at odds with each other, and his forces lacked the cohesion and leadership necessary to face the Macedonian threat. For all its wealth and size, the Persian Empire was a house of cards, ready to collapse under the weight of its own internal divisions and external pressures. By the time Alexander crossed the Hellespont in 334 BCE, the Persian Empire had already lost much of its strength and momentum. Darius III's reign, while technically still in control, was beginning to unravel. His response to Alexander's invasion was slow and uncoordinated. His forces, though vast, were often fragmented, and he lacked the unified strategy necessary to mount an effective defense against the Macedonian onslaught. Alexander's invasion of Persia was not just about military might, it was a clash of civilizations. The Macedonians, who prided themselves on their martial prowess and Greek culture, viewed themselves as the heirs to the Greek city-state's legacy. In contrast, the Persians, with their rich history, were at the zenith of an ancient and sophisticated empire. This cultural divide would form the backdrop of Alexander's historic conquests. While Persia was an ancient and mighty empire, its internal weaknesses made it a prime target for a young and ambitious king like Alexander. His rise to power in Macedon, bolstered by his father's military reforms, his own tactical genius, and the loyalty of his soldiers, allowed him to take on the seemingly indomitable Persian Empire. The stage was now set for the clash that would forever change the course of history. 7. The conquest of Asia Minor. The Battle of the Granicus, 334 BCE. In the spring of 334 BCE, Alexander's campaign against the Persian Empire began in earnest. After crossing the Hellespont into Asia Minor, he faced the first of many major battles in his quest to conquer Persia. The Battle of the Granicus River would prove to be a critical moment in Alexander's journey, demonstrating his military brilliance and cementing his reputation as a commander of unmatched skill. The battle took place near the Granicus River in modern-day Turkey, where Alexander encountered a Persian army led by Memnon of Rhodes, a highly respected general. The Persian forces were significantly larger, numbering around 40,000 to 50,000 men compared to Alexander's army of roughly 35,000 soldiers. While the Persians had the numerical advantage, Alexander's troops were well-trained, highly motivated, and led by a commander who had already earned their trust. Alexander's strategy for the Battle of the Granicus was bold and daring. He knew that a direct confrontation with such a large Persian force would require skillful tactics and precise timing. Instead of engaging in a traditional battle formation, Alexander made use of his unique military innovations, the Macedonian phalanx and cavalry, in ways that his enemies were not prepared for. The key to his victory lay in his ability to outmaneuver and surprise the Persian forces, exploiting the terrain to his advantage. At the onset of the battle, the Persian forces were positioned on higher ground, giving them a strong defensive position. The Persians were hoping to use the Granicus River as a natural barrier to delay Alexander's advance. However, Alexander, known for his audacity, ordered a direct charge across the river. As the Macedonian soldiers rushed toward the riverbank, Alexander led the charge himself, leading the companion cavalry in a swift and decisive assault on the Persian line. Alexander's cavalry proved to be the game-changer. While the Macedonian phalanx advanced on the enemy infantry, the cavalry led by Alexander himself exploited gaps in the Persian lines, hitting the enemy where they were weakest. The Persian forces, caught off guard and unprepared for such an aggressive move, faltered and began to break under the pressure. The battle turned into a rout, with the Macedonians inflicting heavy casualties on the Persians. The victory at Granicus had several key consequences. For one, it allowed Alexander to establish a foothold in Asia Minor, an area that was crucial for furthering his campaign. The Persian satraps, or governors in the region, were forced to retreat, and many of the Greek city-states in Asia Minor, who had previously been under Persian rule, offered their allegiance to Alexander. His conquest of the area not only weakened the Persian presence, but also bolstered his growing reputation as a liberator of the Greek world. The victory also demonstrated the superiority of Macedonian tactics over Persian military formations. While the Persians relied on larger numbers and the traditional heavy infantry and cavalry mix, Alexander's forces were quicker, more cohesive, and more disciplined. The Macedonian military machine, with its powerful infantry phalanx and flexible cavalry, was able to decisively win battles through speed, surprise, and superior strategy. Importantly, the Battle of the Granicus was a turning point for Alexander's campaign. It marked the first major engagement in a series of battles that would ultimately lead to the fall of the Persian Empire. It also established a pattern of Alexander's military approach. He was not just an extraordinary tactician, but a bold and charismatic leader who inspired unwavering loyalty in his troops. Alexander's ability to adapt and respond to the situation at hand became his trademark throughout his campaigns. The aftermath of the Granicus victory saw the Persians retreating in disarray while Alexander's forces continued to move eastward. Following the battle, Alexander quickly secured several key cities in Asia Minor, including Ephesus, Miletus, and Halicarnassus, consolidating his control over the region. The victory also sent shockwaves through the Persian Empire, signaling that the Macedonian threat was real and that Alexander was a force to be reckoned with. But perhaps the most important consequence of the Battle of the Granicus was the boost to Alexander's morale and the morale of his army. This was the first of many victories that would shape the course of Alexander's conquests. His soldiers, who had initially been unsure about the campaign, were now firmly behind him, eager to follow their young king into new battles. As Alexander advanced deeper into Persia's heartland, the success at Granicus set the tone for his future victories and set him on a path that would lead to the downfall of the mighty Persian Empire. The victory at Granicus was just the beginning. Alexander's next move would take him to even greater challenges as he continued his march into Persian territory towards the decisive battles that would change the course of history. His army, strengthened by their first major success, was now a well-oiled war machine, ready to face whatever lay ahead. 8. The Battle of Issus and the Pursuit of Persia. 333 BCE. After his decisive victory at the Granicus River, Alexander the Great continued his relentless march eastward, fully determined to bring the Persian Empire to its knees. In the fall of 333 BC, he faced his next major challenge, the Battle of Issus. This battle, fought near the mouth of the Pinarus River in modern-day Turkey, would prove to be one of Alexander's most significant victories, both in terms of military strategy and its profound psychological impact on Persia. Alexander's forces, though smaller, had already proven themselves in battle. But this time they would face the full might of King Darius III's Persian army, which vastly outnumbered the Macedonian troops. Darius, who had assembled an army of around 100,000 soldiers, believed he could finally crush the Macedonian threat and drive Alexander from Persian territory. The Persian forces were composed of a mix of infantry, cavalry, and war chariots, and Darius himself commanded from the rear of the battlefield, confident that the sheer size of his army would overwhelm Alexander's forces. However, Alexander's ability to read the battlefield and understand the terrain would again prove to be his greatest advantage. Unlike previous Persian commanders, Darius miscalculated the importance of the terrain at Issus. His forces were positioned in a narrow coastal plain bordered by steep mountains on one side and the sea on the other. This constrained the Persian army's ability to maneuver and gave Alexander the perfect opportunity to strike decisively. Alexander's tactics at Issus were rooted in his speed and precision. As the battle began, Alexander ordered a rapid advance, deploying his cavalry on the wings while the phalanx remained tightly organized at the center. His famous companion cavalry, led by him, personally attacked the Persian flanks, exploiting the narrowness of the battlefield. The Persian cavalry, although formidable, struggled to maneuver in the confined space, while Alexander's cavalry managed to break through and attack the heart of Darius's army. But the key to Alexander's success came when he focused directly on Darius himself. Recognizing that the Persian king was positioned in the center of his forces, Alexander led a direct charge through the heart of the Persian lines. His cavalry smashed through the ranks, and Darius, realizing that his position was untenable, was forced to flee the battlefield in the chaos that ensued. The Persian army, leaderless and demoralized, quickly collapsed. The Battle of Issus was not just a military victory for Alexander, it was a significant psychological blow to Persia. Darius III's retreat demonstrated his inability to defend his empire from the Macedonian onslaught, and it marked the beginning of the unraveling of Persian power. In contrast, Alexander's leadership and bravery on the battlefield inspired even greater loyalty among his soldiers, reinforcing their belief in his invincibility. The aftermath of Issus saw the complete destruction of the Persian army's morale. Darius, in a desperate attempt to salvage his empire, sent an emissary to Alexander offering a peace treaty and even offering to cede much of the western part of his empire in exchange for an end to the war. But Alexander, refusing to settle for anything less than total victory, rejected Darius's terms. He was not content with partial victory. Alexander was determined to completely overthrow the Persian king and secure his empire's domination. Alexander's victory at Issus also allowed him to claim rich spoils from the battlefield, including the capture of Darius's family. His mother, wife, and children were taken as prisoners and held by Alexander as hostages, further humiliating Darius. The psychological impact of losing his family was profound, and it drove the Persian king to act rashly, seeking to rebuild his forces and retaliate against the Macedonian invaders. However, this only further fueled Alexander's desire to continue his march into Persia's heartland. In addition to the military victory, Issus served as a political milestone for Alexander. The Greek city-states in the region, many of whom had suffered under Persian rule, began to look to him as a liberator. As he advanced into Syria and Phoenicia, Alexander's reputation grew, and more cities voluntarily surrendered to him. His conquest of the Persian territories provided him with much-needed resources to fund his army and solidify his growing empire. The Persian Empire, which had once seemed invincible, was now in retreat, and its once unified lands were rapidly being swallowed by the Macedonian advance. Alexander's victory at Issus was a powerful symbol of his leadership, military genius, and unyielding determination. It proved that size alone, even for an empire as vast as Persia, was no match for the tactical brilliance and relentless drive of a skilled general. For Alexander, it was yet another confirmation that his destiny was to conquer and rule the known world. But Issus was not the final battle between Alexander and Darius. While Alexander had struck a mighty blow to the Persian forces, Darius was not finished. He would soon regroup and prepare for another confrontation. The Macedonian advance, however, would not stop. Alexander's momentum built from his victory at Issus continued to carry him across the Persian Empire towards Egypt, and ultimately Persia's heartland. The Battle of Issus was a turning point in Alexander's campaign, but the real struggle was just beginning. With his forces in pursuit of the retreating Persian king, Alexander's legendary journey would take him deeper into the heart of the Persian Empire, culminating in the decisive clashes that would forever reshape the ancient world. 9. The Siege of Tyre and the March into Egypt. BCE. After the stunning victory at Issus, Alexander the Great's momentum was unstoppable. His forces pressed forward with confidence, rapidly moving through Syria, Phoenicia, and Palestine, conquering city after city. The Persian Empire was crumbling under his advance, and Alexander's reputation as a conqueror grew. However, one final obstacle lay in his path before he could continue his march toward Egypt and further into the Persian heartland, the island city of Tyre. Tyre was a Phoenician stronghold located off the coast of present-day Lebanon. It was one of the most fortified cities of the ancient world, with its high, impregnable walls standing strong against siege tactics. The city had long been a powerful player in the Mediterranean, controlling key trade routes and serving as a hub for maritime commerce. Despite its size and wealth, Tyre had resisted Persian control, and now it defied Alexander's attempt to bring it under his rule. The siege of Tyre would become one of the most remarkable and innovative military campaigns in Alexander's career. Knowing the city was surrounded by the sea and its defenses were virtually unbreachable from land, Alexander understood that a traditional siege would be impossible. The walls of Tyre were too high and too strong for his siege engines to break. But Alexander, ever resourceful, was not one to back down in the face of a challenge. Instead, he devised an ambitious plan to create a causeway, an artificial land bridge, that would allow his army to bring their siege equipment closer to the city's walls. For months, Alexander's army worked tirelessly to construct the causeway, using the rubble from destroyed buildings, stones, and logs from nearby forests. Despite fierce resistance from Tyrian defenders, who launched repeated attacks from both the city and the sea, the Macedonian forces persevered. In the face of overwhelming odds, Alexander's engineering feats would ultimately win the day. By late spring of 332 BCE, the causeway was complete, and Macedonian siege weapons, including battering rams and siege towers, could finally be used against the city's walls. But even then, Tyre did not surrender easily. The Tyrians fought with everything they had, using fire ships to try to destroy the Macedonian causeway and disrupt the siege. Yet Alexander, always ahead of his adversaries, countered these efforts, with his own naval forces maintaining control of the sea around the city. After months of relentless fighting, including fierce street-to-street combat within the city, the Macedonians finally breached the walls and captured Tyre in July 332 BCE. The siege of Tyre was a testament to Alexander's brilliance as a military strategist and engineer. It not only demonstrated his ingenuity in overcoming seemingly impossible odds, but it also sent a powerful message to the rest of the ancient world. Alexander was a conqueror who would stop at nothing to achieve his goals. His victory at Tyre was a significant step forward in his campaign and opened the door to further conquests. With the city of Tyre under his control, Alexander now turned his attention toward Egypt, a key territory that was part of the Persian Empire, but had long been a target of Greek interest. Egypt had been a rich and prosperous land, but under Persian rule, it had become a shadow of its former self. The Egyptian people, weary of Persian domination, were eager for liberation. Alexander seized on this discontent and moved swiftly into Egypt, where he was welcomed as a liberator. When Alexander entered Memphis, the capital of Egypt, he was greeted as a hero. The Egyptian priests who had long resented Persian rule declared him the son of Amun, a divine title that connected Alexander to the gods of Egypt. This proclamation solidified his position as not only a military leader, but also a divinely appointed ruler. In addition to securing Egypt, this title helped Alexander build strong political ties with the local elite, furthering his control over the region. While in Egypt, Alexander took a moment to establish one of his most enduring legacies, the foundation of the city of Alexandria. Located at the mouth of the Nile River, Alexandria would become the largest city in the ancient world, a hub of culture, knowledge, and commerce. It would remain an important center of learning and power for centuries to come, solidifying Alexander's vision of blending Greek and Eastern cultures. His time in Egypt, however, was not only about consolidating his power. Alexander had a grand vision for his empire, one that extended far beyond the borders of Greece and Egypt. He believed in the idea of a unified empire, one that transcended cultural and geographical boundaries. This vision would shape the direction of his future campaigns as he continued to push eastward into the heart of Persia. The conquest of Egypt was both a strategic and symbolic victory for Alexander. It marked his control over one of the richest and most significant regions of the ancient world, giving him access to vital resources, including grain and wealth, and further strengthening his claim to the mantle of ruler of the known world. Moreover, it showed that Alexander's reach was not confined to Greece and Persia, but extended into North Africa, making his empire even more formidable. After securing Egypt and founding Alexandria, Alexander turned his eyes on the next challenge, the heart of the Persian Empire itself. His victory at Tyre, his conquest of Egypt, and his unbroken series of triumphs solidified his reputation as one of history's greatest military leaders. But the real test of his strength, both as a military commander and as an empire builder, still lay ahead. Alexander was now poised to confront Darius III and the Persian Empire in one of the most decisive battles of his career. As he moved toward the Persian heartland, Alexander's forces would face their greatest test yet in the Battle of Gaugamela, where the fate of the Persian Empire would be decided. 10. The Battle of Gaugamela, the decisive victory, 331 BCE. After his victories in Asia Minor, Egypt, and Tyre, Alexander the Great was closing in on his ultimate goal, the heart of the Persian Empire. His military genius had already earned him a reputation, but the final confrontation with King Darius III at the Battle of Gaugamela, fought in 331 BCE, would solidify his place in history as one of the greatest conquerors the world has ever seen. The Persian Empire, despite its internal weaknesses, still commanded a massive army. By the time Alexander reached the plains of Gaugamela near modern-day Iraq, Darius had gathered an enormous force. Some estimates suggest around $100,000 to 250,000 soldiers, including infantry, cavalry, and war elephants. While the exact size of the armies is disputed, what was clear was that the Persian forces greatly outnumbered Alexander's army, which consisted of about 47,000 men. The odds seemed stacked against the Macedonian king, but Alexander, as always, was undeterred by the size of the enemy's forces. His military brilliance lay not in numbers, but in the tactical flexibility of his army. In preparation for the battle, Alexander carefully studied the terrain and devised a plan to neutralize the Persian numerical advantage. The battlefield at Gaugamela was an open plain which gave both sides the ability to maneuver freely. Darius, eager to prove his superiority, planned to use his numerical advantage to crush the Macedonians through a series of overwhelming attacks. The battle began with the Persian forces advancing on Alexander's positions. Darius, using a traditional approach, attempted to envelop Alexander's forces with his superior numbers. But Alexander, employing his usual tactics, used a combination of speed, precision, and well-timed maneuvers to exploit the Persian weaknesses. He deliberately weakened the center of his line, creating a gap that Darius, eager for a decisive victory, attempted to exploit. As Darius advanced toward this opening, Alexander executed a brilliant maneuver, drawing the Persian forces into a vulnerable position. At the crucial moment, Alexander ordered his cavalry to strike at the Persian flanks, while his elite companion cavalry, under his personal command, charged directly at Darius himself. This direct assault on the Persian king's position caused chaos within the Persian ranks. Darius, realizing the battle was turning in Alexander's favor, attempted to flee the battlefield once again. His flight, combined with the collapse of his lines, caused the Persian forces to disintegrate in a rout. The Macedonian cavalry pursued the fleeing Persians, inflicting heavy casualties and securing a total victory. The Battle of Gaugamela was decisive on multiple levels. Militarily, it marked the end of the Persian Empire's dominance in the ancient world. The loss at Gaugamela shattered Persian morale, leading to the disintegration of their military resistance. The Persian king Darius III was once again forced to flee, leaving behind his army and his empire. This would be the final defeat of Darius, who would soon be assassinated by his own men, effectively bringing an end to the Achaemenid dynasty. For Alexander, Gaugamela represented not just a military victory, but the realization of his grand vision. By defeating Darius and his immense army, Alexander became the unquestioned ruler of the Persian Empire, cementing his place as one of history's greatest military commanders. His victory allowed him to capture Babylon, Susa, and Persepolis, the capitals of the Persian Empire, and to claim the vast riches of the defeated empire. Beyond its military significance, Gaugamela had profound psychological consequences. It was a crushing blow to Persian prestige, and the surrender of major cities demonstrated the fragility of Persian control over their vast territories. Alexander's victory was a symbol of the success of his vision of empire, one that spanned from Greece to Egypt to Persia. His ambition to unify the known world under his rule seemed closer to realization than ever before. However, the victory at Gaugamela was also a moment of transformation. As Alexander entered the heart of Persia, he realized that the conquest of an empire was far more than simply defeating an enemy on the battlefield. The true challenge would lie in governing the vast and diverse lands he had conquered. From the moment of his victory, Alexander faced the task of building an empire that could bridge the cultures of the East and West, melding Persian customs with Greek ideals. One of Alexander's key decisions after Gaugamela was to adopt many of the symbols and practices of Persian royalty. He began to dress in Persian clothing and insisted that his soldiers address him as King of Kings, a title used by Persian monarchs. This cultural fusion was part of Alexander's broader policy of promoting unity among his empire's diverse populations. While this policy of integration was controversial, it was designed to ensure stability in the newly formed empire. Despite the victory at Gaugamela and the fall of the Persian Empire, Alexander's conquest was far from over. He still had to deal with various regions that resisted Macedonian rule, as well as the ongoing challenges of maintaining an empire that stretched across 3 continents. In many ways, the aftermath of Gaugamela was just as challenging as the battle itself. Alexander would soon face the monumental task of governing the vast Persian territories, all while continuing his campaign eastward toward India. The Battle of Gaugamela was a key turning point in the history of the ancient world. It marked the end of the Persian Empire and the rise of Macedonian supremacy. Alexander's military brilliance and bold vision transformed the ancient world, laying the foundations for a new empire that would shape the course of history for centuries to come. 11. Conquering the heart of the Persian Empire. Persepolis and beyond, 330 BCE. After the stunning victory at the Battle of Gaugamela, Alexander the Great found himself on the verge of total domination over the Persian Empire. With Darius III defeated and fleeing, the vast Persian Empire now lay before him, ripe for conquest. One of the most symbolic moments of his campaign would come with the capture of Persepolis, the magnificent capital of the Achaemenid Empire, which represented the zenith of Persian power and culture. Persepolis, founded by Darius the Fëanor in the 5th century BCE, was a city unlike any other in the ancient world. Its grand palaces, temples, and ceremonial halls, adorned with intricate carvings and massive columns, were a testament to the glory and sophistication of the Persian Empire. It was the political and cultural heart of Persia, where the wealth of the empire was displayed in all its splendor. For Alexander, the capture of Persepolis was not just a military victory. It was a symbolic conquest of the empire itself. After the battle at Gaugamela, Alexander's army swiftly moved south, taking key cities along the way. By early 330 BCE, his forces reached Persepolis, and the city's fate was sealed. Despite its defenses, Persepolis fell with little resistance, as many of its defenders were either demoralized by Darius's flight or had already fled. Alexander's forces looted the city, claiming vast treasures and riches that had once belonged to the Persian kings. But the greatest act of symbolism came shortly after the fall of Persepolis. In a dramatic act of defiance and to send a message to the Persian elite, Alexander ordered the destruction of Persepolis. The exact reasons behind this decision are debated by historians, but the most commonly accepted explanation is that Alexander sought to erase the grandeur of the Persian Empire, marking its collapse and cementing his own dominance. The destruction was swift and devastating. Many of Persepolis's most iconic buildings were set ablaze, and its treasures were looted or destroyed. The fire that consumed the city is said to have lasted for days, a fitting end to the once great capital of the Persian Empire. While the destruction of Persepolis was a symbolic act, it was also a clear indication of Alexander's resolve to create his own legacy free from the shadow of the Persian kings. Alexander, although he admired the cultural achievements of Persia, sought to define himself as a conqueror in his own right. He would no longer be seen as just the heir to the Greek city-states or the conqueror of Persia. He was now the ruler of a vast empire that stretched from Greece to the borders of India. The fall of Persepolis marked the end of the Persian Empire and the beginning of Alexander's reign over the Achaemenid territories. But even as he celebrated his victories and looked to secure the empire, Alexander's challenges were far from over. The territories of Persia were vast and diverse, and ruling such an enormous expanse would require more than just military conquest. It would require careful governance, diplomacy, and a nuanced approach to the cultures and peoples within his empire. One of Alexander's key decisions after taking Persepolis was to maintain the administrative structure of the Persian Empire. He recognized that the Persian bureaucracy had been highly effective in governing such a vast territory, and rather than dismantling it, he sought to integrate the Persian administrators into his own government. This was part of his broader strategy of cultural fusion, where he encouraged the blending of Greek and Persian customs. For example, he began to adopt Persian dress and customs, and he introduced the practice of Persian-style royal ceremonies, even including some Persian nobility in his court. Alexander also focused on securing the territories he had just conquered, ensuring that they remained loyal to his rule. He established several new Macedonian colonies, which served as military outposts and hubs of Greek culture. These cities, like Alexandria in Egypt, would be key to Alexander's vision of spreading Greek culture across the known world. The cities also acted as a means to maintain control over the vast expanse of the empire by ensuring a continued Greek presence in strategic locations. But despite his success in Persia and his efforts to unite East and West, Alexander's reign would not be without resistance. While the fall of Persepolis signaled the collapse of the Persian Empire, many regions within the empire were still rife with discontent and rebellion. The ancient satrapies of Persia, Bactria, and Sogdiana would soon rise up, testing Alexander's leadership and military might once again. Alexander's time in Persia also marked a shift in his thinking. As he progressed deeper into the empire, he became more ambitious and increasingly focused on creating an empire that went beyond simply defeating the Persians. He began to look further eastward, considering campaigns into India and even Central Asia, but his plans for expansion would not come without a cost. His soldiers, many of whom had been with him for years, began to show signs of fatigue. They had marched across vast distances, fought countless battles, and seen the fall of two great empires. As Alexander pushed further east, cracks began to appear in his army's resolve. Nevertheless, the conquest of Persepolis and the subsequent capture of Persia marked a major milestone in Alexander's journey. The Persian Empire, once the greatest power in the world, was no more. In its place stood the Macedonian Empire, an empire that stretched from the shores of the Mediterranean to the banks of the Indus River. And yet, as Alexander would soon discover, the challenges of empire building were far from over. The future of his empire would depend not only on his military genius, but also on his ability to govern, unify, and secure the vast lands he had conquered. With Persia firmly under his control, Alexander turned his attention to new frontiers, but the journey ahead would not be easy. His campaign would soon take him into India, where a new and fierce adversary awaited him, the powerful King Porus and the ancient forces of the Indian subcontinent. 12. The campaign in India, crossing the Hindu Kush, and the Battle of the Hydaspes. 1026 BC. By 326 BCE, Alexander the Great had conquered an empire that stretched from the shores of the Aegean Sea to the heart of Persia. And now his gaze turned eastward toward the great lands of India. His previous victories, such as the fall of Persepolis and his march through Asia, had left a trail of awe and fear in their wake. However, the journey into India would be his most challenging, both physically and psychologically, and the final battles of his conquests would test his resolve and leadership in ways he had never experienced before. The first obstacle for Alexander was the Hindu Kush mountain range, which formed a natural barrier between Persia and India. The mountains were treacherous and difficult to navigate, but Alexander's army, hardened by years of campaigning, pressed on. His forces crossed the Hindu Kush in the winter of 327 BCE, enduring the harsh conditions of the mountain pass and the freezing cold temperatures. Despite the difficulties, Alexander's army managed to reach the plains of the Indus River by the following spring, ready to face whatever lay ahead. Upon entering India, Alexander encountered a series of kingdoms and tribes, many of whom had heard of his legendary conquests. The first significant Indian kingdom that Alexander came across was that of King Porus, a ruler who commanded a large and powerful force. Porus's kingdom, located in the region of present-day Pakistan, was known for its wealth, its strong military, and its elephants, which were feared by all who faced them in battle. The Battle of the Hydaspes, fought in 326 BCE near the Hydaspes River, modern-day Jhelum River, would become one of the defining moments of Alexander's campaign in India. The battle would not only demonstrate the military genius of Alexander, but it would also be the final conflict that would push his army to its breaking point. The battle began with Alexander's forces facing off against Porus's army, which was positioned on the other side of the river. Porus had an advantage in numbers and had placed his troops along the banks of the river, preparing to defend against an attack. The challenge for Alexander was to cross the river and engage the enemy without falling into a trap. In typical fashion, Alexander relied on his brilliant tactical mind and took advantage of the geography. Alexander decided to cross the river upstream, where the current was weaker and the riverbanks less steep. Under the cover of night, his soldiers stealthily crossed the Hydaspes and set up a camp on the far side, out of view of the Indian forces. The next morning, Porus was stunned to see the Macedonian army ready for battle on his side of the river, having crossed without his knowledge. The element of surprise was on Alexander's side, and he wasted no time in attacking. As the battle unfolded, the true challenge for Alexander came from Porus's war elephants, which were a formidable force. These massive creatures were heavily armored and trained for battle, and they charged into the Macedonian lines with terrifying force. However, Alexander had anticipated this and used his cavalry and archers to target the elephants and their riders, eventually causing panic and disarray in the Indian ranks. Despite Porus's valiant resistance, the Macedonian forces slowly began to encircle his army. Alexander's cavalry, once again playing a decisive role, struck at the enemy's flanks and rear, while the phalanx pushed forward. The battle was hard fought, but after hours of intense combat, Porus's army was decisively defeated. The Indian king was captured, but treated with respect by Alexander, who admired his bravery and leadership. In a gesture of diplomacy, Alexander allowed Porus to keep his kingdom, seeking to integrate him into his own expanding empire, rather than destroying him. The victory at the Battle of the Hydaspes was a testament to Alexander's military brilliance, but it was also a significant moment of transition in his campaign. The battle marked the furthest eastern point of his conquests, and it was the final major engagement that would secure his control over the Indian subcontinent. But it also marked the point where Alexander's army began to show signs of exhaustion. His men, who had been campaigning for years across vast distances, were now deeply fatigued. The monsoon season was approaching, and many of his soldiers were homesick and unwilling to continue further into India. The victory over Porus was a stunning accomplishment, but it was not without its cost. The men who had followed Alexander across Persia, Egypt, and the Indian subcontinent were now questioning the wisdom of pushing further east. They had already endured long marches, countless battles, and harsh environments, and the thought of marching even deeper into India with no end in sight was more than many could bear. Faced with mounting dissent within his ranks, Alexander made the difficult decision to turn back. He had conquered most of the known world by the age of 32, but his dream of expanding even further into the heart of India would remain unfulfilled. His army began its long and arduous journey back westward, retracing their steps through the Hindu Kush and down the Indus River. Alexander's campaign in India was his final and most ambitious military endeavor. The Battle of the Hydaspes not only secured his place in history as a military genius, but it also demonstrated his ability to adapt to new and unfamiliar challenges. In defeating Porus, Alexander proved that his strategies could overcome even the unique difficulties posed by the Indian subcontinent. However, the toll of continuous warfare on Alexander's army and the limits of his soldiers' endurance meant that after this victory, the Macedonian conquests would come to an end. Alexander's dream of creating a vast empire stretching across 3 continents had been realized, but it was not to last forever. His return journey would mark the beginning of the decline of his empire, and the tensions within his army would eventually lead to his untimely death just a few years later. The campaign in India was one of Alexander's crowning achievements, but it was also the moment where the limits of his empire-building vision began to show. Even Alexander the Great, for all his brilliance and ambition, was unable to overcome the human desire for rest, stability, and home. The road ahead would lead to new challenges, but it would also be a road that Alexander would not live to see. 13. The challenges of governing a vast empire. By 326 BCE, Alexander the Great had built an empire that spanned from Greece to India, covering vast stretches of territory and a variety of cultures and peoples. His military brilliance had led him to conquer one of the largest empires the ancient world had ever known. But with victory came new challenges. As Alexander's forces began their long return westward, the reality of empire building set in, and Alexander found himself faced with the daunting task of governing a vast and diverse empire. Unlike the Romans, who would later develop a sophisticated system of provincial governance, Alexander's empire was held together primarily by his charismatic leadership, his military prowess, and the loyalty of his soldiers. He had no real plan for how to govern such an expansive territory, and his rapid conquests had not left much time for establishing a sustainable system of administration. His empire was a patchwork of Greek colonies, Persian satrapies, and newly conquered territories, each with its own traditions, languages, and political systems. One of the most pressing issues Alexander faced was how to integrate the East and West within his empire. The Greeks and Macedonians were vastly different from the Persian, Egyptian, and Indian peoples they had conquered, and Alexander realized that he needed to find a way to unite these diverse cultures under a single banner. His solution was a policy of cultural fusion, which involved adopting some elements of Persian and Eastern culture, while maintaining a strong Greek influence. One of the most controversial aspects of Alexander's reign was his decision to adopt Persian royal customs. He began to wear Persian clothing, and he introduced the practice of proskynesis, a Persian form of ritual submission in which subjects would bow or kneel before the king. This act was highly unpopular among Alexander's Greek and Macedonian soldiers, who viewed it as a sign of weakness and a break from Greek traditions. Many saw it as an attempt by Alexander to position himself as a Persian-style monarch rather than the leader of a Greek empire. Another significant challenge was maintaining the loyalty of his conquered peoples. Alexander's policy of integration was designed to blend Greek and Persian cultures, but it was not always welcomed by those he conquered. While many of the Greeks and Macedonians in his army viewed Alexander as a liberator, the local populations often saw him as a conqueror imposing foreign rule. Alexander attempted to bridge this divide by incorporating local customs and elites into his administration. He married Roxane, a Persian princess, and encouraged his soldiers to marry local women, creating political alliances and forging connections between different cultures. He also appointed Persian nobles to positions of power within his government, a move that further alienated some of his Greek and Macedonian followers. Military governance was another aspect of Alexander's empire that needed attention. The Macedonian military, which had been his primary tool for conquest, was now responsible for maintaining order in the vast lands Alexander had conquered. Alexander relied on his army not just to fight wars, but to oversee the administration of cities and regions. This reliance on the military meant that his empire lacked a civilian bureaucracy, capable of governing effectively over such a wide area. As a result, Alexander's empire was in many ways a military dictatorship, held together by the personal loyalty of his soldiers and the constant presence of Macedonian forces in key regions. To help manage the empire, Alexander established new cities, many of which were named Alexandria after himself. These cities were intended to serve as centers of Greek culture and governance in the conquered territories. In each city, Alexander established Greek-style institutions, such as theaters, gymnasiums, and markets, aiming to create a unified cultural identity across his empire. However, these cities were often viewed with suspicion by local populations, who saw them as symbols of foreign rule. Many of these cities, despite being built with the intention of strengthening the empire, would eventually become centers of rebellion against Macedonian rule. Alexander also faced the challenge of securing the loyalty of his satraps, the regional governors, who oversaw the administration of the empire's various territories. While many satraps were loyal to Alexander, there were occasional uprisings and conspiracies against his rule. The vast size of the empire meant that it was difficult to maintain control over distant provinces, and the constant movement of Alexander's forces prevented him from being able to personally oversee every part of his empire. The mutiny at the Hyphasis River in 326 BCE was one of the most significant signs of discontent within Alexander's army. After years of relentless campaigning, Alexander's soldiers, many of whom had been with him since his first campaigns in Asia Minor, refused to march further into India. They had reached the Hyphasis River, modern-day Bays River, and the prospect of fighting against the powerful kingdoms further east was too much for them. Alexander's soldiers, exhausted and homesick, demanded to return home. This moment marked a turning point for Alexander, as he realized that even his charisma and leadership could not overcome the exhaustion and war-weariness of his men. In the face of his army's rebellion, Alexander had no choice but to turn back. He began the long journey westward, retracing the steps that had taken him from Greece to India. The return to Macedon was filled with grief and sorrow, as Alexander's soldiers mourned their fallen comrades and the empire they had built. For Alexander, the question of succession also loomed large. With no clear heir to the throne, Alexander's death would soon lead to a bitter struggle for control of his vast empire. Despite the challenges of governing such an enormous and diverse empire, Alexander's vision of a unified world lived on in the Hellenistic period that followed his death. His conquests had brought Greek culture and influence to the farthest corners of the known world, leaving a lasting legacy that would shape the future of the Mediterranean and beyond. However, the lack of a strong system of governance and the internal divisions within his empire would ultimately lead to its fragmentation, as his generals and successors, known as the Diadochi, fought for control of his territories. Alexander's empire, built through military conquest and personal ambition, would not survive long after his death. But the cultural exchange he initiated, the spread of Greek ideas, art, language, and governance, would have a lasting impact, influencing the development of the Hellenistic kingdoms and the Roman Empire that would follow. His reign, though short-lived, set the stage for the blending of East and West, and his legacy would resonate throughout history. 14. The death of Alexander, a turning point in history. 323 BCE. Alexander the Great's death at the age of 32 in 323 BCE was as sudden as it was mysterious. After spending most of his life on the battlefield, leading his army from victory to victory across vast stretches of territory, his sudden passing left the world in shock. His untimely death in the palace of Babylon, a city he had hoped to make the center of his new empire, marked the end of an era. Yet his death also set the stage for the disintegration of his empire, as his conquests lacked the stability necessary to survive without him. The circumstances surrounding Alexander's death remain clouded in mystery. Various theories have been proposed over the centuries, ranging from natural causes, such as fever brought on by malaria or typhoid, to the possibility of poisoning. Some sources suggest that Alexander fell ill after a banquet, suffering from a sudden fever that worsened over the course of several days. His decline was swift, and despite the efforts of his physicians, he died after a week of illness. His death was a monumental shock to those around him, especially to the soldiers who had followed him across continents. But the question of how Alexander died is ultimately less significant than the implications of his passing. At the time of his death, Alexander had no clear heir. His only legitimate child, Alexander IV, was still an infant, and his wife Roxane had no political power to assert control. Without a strong successor in place, Alexander's empire, already vast and diverse, was thrown into chaos. His generals, known as the Diadochi, immediately began vying for power, eager to claim a portion of the empire for themselves. Alexander's empire, though united under his rule, was a loose confederation held together by his military might and personal charisma. It lacked the institutional structures needed to govern such a vast territory without a central authority. The absence of a strong successor meant that the empire was fractured almost immediately after Alexander's death. The generals and satraps governors of the empire, many of whom had been appointed by Alexander himself, began to carve up the empire into warring factions. What followed was a series of wars known as the Wars of the Diadochi, as these former companions and rivals fought to secure control over the territories Alexander had conquered. The empire, once a unified force under Alexander, was divided into several key regions, each controlled by a different general. Ptolemy took control of Egypt, where he established the Ptolemaic dynasty, which would last for centuries and become one of the most powerful kingdoms in the Mediterranean. Seleucus gained control of the vast eastern territories, including Babylon, Persia, and Mesopotamia, forming the Seleucid Empire. Antigonus initially took control of Macedonia and parts of Asia Minor, but would later be challenged in the power struggles that followed. Cassander, another of Alexander's generals, would later claim control of Macedonia, securing his position as one of the primary contenders for power. Despite the fragmentation of the empire, Alexander's vision of a culturally unified world lived on. The Greek language and culture spread across the territories of the former Persian Empire, and the Hellenistic period, which followed Alexander's death, saw the blending of Greek and Eastern cultures in many of the regions he had conquered. The cities that Alexander founded, like Alexandria in Egypt, became centers of Hellenistic culture, promoting Greek ideals of philosophy, science, and art, while integrating local traditions. The impact of Alexander's conquests can still be seen today in the many legacies of the Hellenistic world, which laid the foundation for future empires, including Rome. However, the political stability and unity that had defined Alexander's reign were never restored. The Diadochi Wars, which erupted after Alexander's death, resulted in the eventual collapse of the Macedonian Empire. While the various successor states continued to thrive, they were constantly embroiled in conflict, and none of them could ever recreate the grandeur or unity of Alexander's empire. Over time, the empire fragmented into smaller kingdoms, and the once mighty Macedonian Empire ceased to exist as a unified entity. The death of Alexander the Great also marked the end of an era of military conquest and the dawn of a new age of political fragmentation. The military campaigns that had once unified the known world were replaced by internal struggles for power. But even in death, Alexander's influence continued to shape the world. His legacy would influence the rise of Rome, the spread of Greek culture, and the development of Eastern empires, including the Seleucid Empire and Ptolemaic Egypt. As for Alexander himself, his death solidified his place in history as one of the greatest military leaders ever known. His vision of a unified world, his tactical brilliance, and his ability to inspire loyalty in his men all contributed to his legendary status. He achieved what most emperors and conquerors could only dream of: the conquest of the known world. But in the end, the question that remains is whether Alexander's empire was ever truly sustainable without him. His personal ambition and charisma had created an empire of vast proportions, but his sudden death revealed the fragility of such an empire. Alexander the Great's untimely death remains one of the most significant turning points in world history. It not only marked the end of his extraordinary journey, but also led to the fragmentation of the empire he had spent his life building. Yet even as his empire fragmented, Alexander's influence continued to resonate, leaving a lasting legacy that would shape the course of history for centuries to come. 15. The division of the Macedonian Empire. The Wars of the Diadochi, 323–281 BCE. In the wake of Alexander the Great's sudden death, his vast empire was thrown into disarray. With no clear heir to the throne and no established system of succession, the power vacuum left by his passing led to one of the most chaotic and bloody periods in ancient history, the Wars of the Diadochi. These wars, fought between Alexander's closest generals and companions, were a struggle for control over the immense territory that stretched from Greece to India. The Diadochi, meaning successors in Greek, were the men who had served under Alexander and helped him conquer much of the ancient world. They were battle-hardened commanders who had followed him on his military campaigns for years. Upon Alexander's death, they sought to carve out their own kingdoms from the fragmented empire. Despite Alexander's vision of a unified empire, the lack of a strong, centralized system of government meant that his generals quickly began to fight for control over different regions. The first major division of the empire occurred at the partition of Babylon in 323 BCE, shortly after Alexander's death. In this meeting, his generals divided the empire into territories, with each general receiving control over a different part of the vast empire. However, this division was temporary and would prove to be unstable. The generals' ambitions for greater power led to constant infighting as they attempted to seize control of more territory. Key figures in the wars included Ptolemy I Soter, who took control of Egypt and established the Ptolemaic dynasty, which would rule Egypt for nearly 3 centuries. Ptolemy's strategic control of Egypt and its wealth, along with his successful establishment of Alexandria as a cultural and intellectual center, would ensure the long-term success of his kingdom. Seleucus IV Nicator, who seized control of the vast eastern territories of the empire, including Mesopotamia, Persia, and parts of India. Seleucus eventually founded the Seleucid Empire, which spanned a huge area stretching from modern-day Turkey to Afghanistan. Antigonus the Phryarch's Monophthalmus, who initially controlled large parts of Asia Minor and Syria. His ambitions eventually led him into direct conflict with other Diadochi, and his eventual death in 301 BCE marked the end of his plans to reunite Alexander's empire. Cassander, who took control of Macedonia and the western part of the empire, including Greece. He was involved in the murder of Alexander's mother Olympias and eventually became one of the most powerful figures in the struggle for control of the empire. The Wars of the Diadochi were marked by a series of brutal and lengthy conflicts, as each general sought to solidify his control over the territories. Alliances were constantly shifting, and the battles were often fierce as former allies turned on each other in their quest for supremacy. The wars didn't just take place on land. The Diadochi also engaged in diplomatic maneuvering, forming alliances and making betrayals to secure their power. While some of the Diadochi were able to carve out powerful kingdoms, others were defeated or killed in battle, leaving their territories to be absorbed by more powerful rivals. One of the most decisive conflicts was the Battle of Ipsus in 301 BCE, where the forces of Antigonus were decisively defeated by a coalition of Seleucus, Lysimachus, and Ptolemy. The death of Antigonus marked the end of his dream of reuniting Alexander's empire under his rule. After Ipsus, the empire was effectively divided into 3 main Hellenistic kingdoms: the Ptolemaic kingdom in Egypt under Ptolemy, the Seleucid Empire, which stretched from the eastern Mediterranean to Persia under Seleucus, the Antigonid kingdom in Macedonia and Greece under Cassander and later his successors. Although Alexander's empire was divided, his legacy continued to shape the world for centuries. The Hellenistic kingdoms, though independent, shared a common Greek culture, which continued to spread across the eastern Mediterranean and into Asia. Greek language, philosophy, art, and science flourished in these kingdoms, particularly in cities like Alexandria in Egypt, which became one of the most important cultural centers of the ancient world. However, the wars and fragmentation of the empire had long-term consequences. The Hellenistic period, though marked by cultural achievements, was also a time of continuous warfare. The successor kingdoms were often at war with each other, and internal conflicts destabilized the once vast empire. The lack of a unified political system and the absence of a strong central ruler left the Diadochi vulnerable to external threats, particularly from the growing power of Rome. By the end of the 3rd century BCE, the once grand empire of Alexander had been divided into smaller kingdoms. The Seleucid Empire weakened, eventually falling to Roman expansion in the 2nd century BCE. The Ptolemaic kingdom in Egypt continued to survive until the Roman conquest in 30 BCE following the defeat of Cleopatra VII. And Macedonia, after a brief period of power, eventually succumbed to Roman domination in 146 BCE. Despite the fragmentation of Alexander's empire, the legacy of his conquests and his vision for a culturally unified world lived on. The cities he founded, the spread of Greek culture, and the Hellenistic kingdoms that emerged from his empire left a profound impact on the ancient world. Greek ideas and practices would influence everything from philosophy to science, and the Hellenistic period would set the stage for the rise of Rome and the eventual spread of Roman rule across the Mediterranean. In the end, Alexander's empire did not survive his death, but the world he left behind was forever changed. His conquests brought East and West together, spreading Greek ideas and establishing a new era of cultural exchange. While the empire was fragmented after his death, the Hellenistic world that emerged was a testament to his vision and his ability to create a lasting legacy. 16. The rise of successor states, Ptolemaic Egypt, Seleucid Empire, and Antigonid Macedon. The division of Alexander the Great's empire into separate realms was a direct consequence of the chaos that followed his sudden death. Although the wars of the Diadochi saw the eventual division of the empire into 3 main Hellenistic kingdoms, Ptolemaic Egypt, Seleucid Syria, and Antigonid Macedonia. Each successor state brought with it its own unique culture, politics, and legacy, all shaped by the rapid expansion of Greek influence under Alexander's rule. 1. The Ptolemaic Kingdom of Egypt, a thriving center of culture and power of all the successor states. The Ptolemaic Kingdom of Egypt would prove to be the most enduring and influential. Established by Ptolemy Soter, one of Alexander's most trusted generals, Egypt remained under Macedonian control for nearly 3 centuries after Alexander's death. Ptolemy, having secured Egypt after Alexander's passing, founded the Ptolemaic dynasty, which would rule Egypt until its eventual absorption into the Roman Empire in 30 BCE. Under the Ptolemies, Egypt became a cultural and intellectual powerhouse. Alexandria, the kingdom's capital, became the most famous city of the ancient world. It was a center of learning, attracting scholars, philosophers, and scientists from across the Mediterranean. The Library of Alexandria, one of the largest and most important libraries of the ancient world, was founded during the reign of Ptolemy II Philadelphus in the 3rd century BCE. This library housed countless works from Greek, Egyptian, and other cultures, making Alexandria the intellectual heart of the Hellenistic world. In addition to its intellectual achievements, the Ptolemaic dynasty also presided over a prosperous and stable Egypt. The Ptolemies maintained Egypt's wealth through control of trade routes, including the vital Red Sea and Nile River trade networks. However, the dynasty also faced internal challenges, including dynastic struggles and resistance from the native Egyptian population, who resented the Greek rulers and the imposition of foreign rule. The Ptolemies, unlike Alexander, were unable to fully integrate the Greek and Egyptian cultures, which led to periodic unrest throughout the kingdom. While the Ptolemies were able to establish a strong monarchy, the dynasty began to weaken during the 2nd century BCE. The infamous reign of Cleopatra VII, the last Ptolemaic ruler, would become a defining moment in Egypt's history. Cleopatra's alliance with Julius Caesar and her subsequent relationship with Mark Antony led to a fierce conflict with Octavian, the future Roman Emperor Augustus. The defeat of Antony and Cleopatra at the Battle of Actium in 31 BCE and their subsequent suicides marked the end of the Ptolemaic dynasty, and Egypt was annexed into the Roman Empire. 2. The Seleucid Empire. The struggle for control of the East. The Seleucid Empire, established by Seleucus Nicator, spanned a vast region that included much of the former Persian Empire, stretching from Syria and Mesopotamia to India. Seleucus, who had been granted control over the eastern territories after Alexander's death, founded the Seleucid dynasty and became one of the most powerful figures in the Hellenistic world. The Seleucid Empire was vast, but faced many challenges. Its vast size made it difficult to control, and its numerous diverse peoples, ranging from Greeks and Macedonians to Persians and Egyptians, complicated efforts at integration. The Seleucids, like the Ptolemies, struggled with internal divisions, and the empire's vastness meant that much of its territory was poorly governed. However, Seleucus and his successors were able to establish Greek cities and spread Hellenistic culture across much of the empire. The Seleucid Empire's military power and ability to control key trade routes made it an essential power in the Hellenistic world. Yet the empire was plagued by continual conflict with the Ptolemies in Egypt, especially over the control of Syria, and the Seleucid monarchy was constantly under threat from external invasions and internal rebellion. The empire would eventually weaken due to dynastic struggles and the rise of local powers, culminating in the eventual fall of the Seleucid Empire to Roman expansion. 3. The Antigonid Kingdom. The rise and fall of Macedon. The Antigonid Kingdom of Macedonia, established by Antigonus III Monophthalmus, was the most direct successor to Alexander's heartland of Greece and Macedonia. After the death of Antigonus in 301 BCE, his son Demetrius, and later his descendants, ruled over Macedonia, but the kingdom was consistently plagued by challenges from rival Hellenistic states and Rome. While the Antigonid dynasty retained control over Macedonia, it was unable to fully recapture the glory of Alexander's reign. The Antigonid kings faced constant threats from Rome, which had begun its expansion into Greece by the 2nd century BCE. The kingdom's eventual defeat came in 168 BCE when the Romans defeated the last Antigonid king Perseus at the Battle of Pydna. Following this defeat, Macedonia was absorbed into the Roman Republic, and the Antigonid dynasty came to an end. Though short-lived, the Antigonid kingdom was important in maintaining Greek culture and traditions in the western part of Alexander's empire. While it never achieved the political unity of Alexander's empire, it kept Macedonian influence alive in the region, paving the way for future interactions between Greek and Roman cultures. The legacy of the successor states. A divided world united by culture. Though the successor states ruled by the Diadochi were politically fragmented, Alexander's conquest ensured that his cultural legacy endured across the ancient world. The Hellenistic period, which followed the fragmentation of Alexander's empire, was marked by the spread of Greek language ideas and art across vast regions of the ancient world. Greek became the lingua franca in much of the eastern Mediterranean and beyond, influencing everything from philosophy to science, architecture, and art. The founding of cities such as Alexandria, Antioch, and Seleucia helped spread Greek urbanization throughout the conquered lands, creating cultural melting pots where East and West could meet. These cities became centers of learning, commerce, and cultural exchange, and they would continue to play a significant role in the world long after Alexander's death. Even as Alexander's empire fragmented, the success of his successors in spreading Greek culture made the Hellenistic period a time of profound cultural development. Hellenistic science and philosophy flourished, producing key figures such as Euclid, Archimedes, and Epicurus, whose works would continue to influence intellectual thought for centuries. Likewise, Hellenistic art, characterized by realism and emotion, became a defining feature of the ancient world. Yet despite the cultural achievements of the Hellenistic kingdoms, their political instability, dynastic struggles, and the rise of Rome ensured that the empire Alexander had built would not last. As the successor states battled each other for control and faced external pressures from the expanding Roman Empire, the Hellenistic world gradually fell under Roman control, marking the end of Alexander's grand vision for a unified empire. Still, Alexander's impact remained. His conquests reshaped the ancient world, and the cultural exchange between East and West that he initiated would influence the Roman Empire and eventually the development of Western civilization itself. 17. The decline of Macedon, the fall of Antigonid power. 68 BCE. The Antigonid kingdom of Macedon, which had been established after the wars of the Diadochi, was the last of Alexander the Great's original empire to fall. By the mid-2nd century, BCE, Macedon found itself increasingly under pressure from an expanding power to the West Rome. The fall of Macedon marked the end of Hellenistic political independence and the beginning of Roman dominance in the eastern Mediterranean. The decline of the Antigonid dynasty began well before the final blow came in 168 BCE. After the defeat of Perseus, the last ruler of the Antigonid dynasty, Macedon was effectively destroyed as a power in the ancient world. The roots of this decline can be traced back to internal political instability, frequent dynastic struggles, and the inability to adapt to the changing political landscape of the Hellenistic world. Though Macedonia had its moments of strength and strategic importance, it was increasingly outmatched by the rise of Roman power in the Mediterranean. One of the key factors in the fall of Macedon was its failure to maintain alliances with the rising Roman Republic. Over the course of the 3rd and 2nd centuries, BCE, Rome's influence steadily increased in the region, with the Romans seeking to extend their control over the Greek world. At the same time, Macedon's increasingly corrupt leadership, military failures, and instability made it vulnerable to external threats. The Romans, recognizing the importance of securing control over the Greek heartlands, became increasingly involved in Macedonian affairs. The final act in the fall of Macedon came during the Third Macedonian War, which culminated in the Battle of Pydna in 168 BCE. This decisive clash between the forces of Perseus, the last Antigonid king, and the Roman army, led by Lucius Aemilius Paulus, sealed Macedon's fate. Despite a sizable army, Perseus's forces were decisively defeated by the more disciplined and experienced Roman legions. The battle itself was a turning point, marking the last significant resistance to Roman dominance in the Greek world. After the battle, Macedon was thoroughly defeated. Perseus was captured and brought to Rome in a humiliating procession. The Romans stripped the kingdom of its power and resources, disbanding the once proud Antigonid monarchy. They divided the territory of Macedon into 4 client republics to ensure there would be no further unified resistance. The Roman Senate, seeing the danger of a resurgent Macedon, ensured that it would no longer be a threat. Finally, in 146 BCE, the Roman conquest of Greece was complete, and Macedon was formally annexed as a province of the growing Roman Empire. The fall of Macedon marked the end of Hellenistic independence. For centuries, the Greek city-states and the Hellenistic kingdoms had been the dominant political and military powers in the Mediterranean. Yet the rise of Rome, combined with the internal weaknesses of the successor states, led to the eventual absorption of the entire region into the Roman Empire. The defeat of Macedon and the destruction of the Antigonid kingdom were significant events that reshaped the entire geopolitical landscape of the Mediterranean. By this time, Rome had emerged as the new dominant power, and the long-standing influence of the Hellenistic world began to give way to Roman control. However, despite its fall, the legacy of Macedon, and particularly the legacy of Alexander the Great, continued to reverberate throughout history. The cultural diffusion that Alexander initiated through his conquests had spread Greek ideas, philosophy, art, and language throughout much of the ancient world. The Hellenistic cities and the Greek-influenced regions would continue to thrive as intellectual and cultural hubs for centuries to come, even under Roman rule. In a sense, the cultural empire Alexander created lived on in the very fabric of Roman society. Though Macedon as a political entity disappeared, its influence persisted through the Hellenistic culture that Alexander had brought to the far reaches of the ancient world. From the arts to philosophy, mathematics to science, the Greek ideals that Alexander had spread were absorbed into the Roman Empire, contributing to the development of Western civilization. The end of the Antigonid kingdom in 168 BCE, while signaling the loss of Hellenistic independence, marked the beginning of a new chapter in Mediterranean history, one in which Greek culture would be carried on by the Romans, and the influence of Alexander's empire would continue to shape the course of history for generations. 18. The legacy of the Macedonian Empire. While the Macedonian Empire itself did not survive long after the death of Alexander the Great, the legacy of his conquests and vision left an indelible mark on the ancient world. Even as the empire fragmented into successor states and was eventually absorbed by Rome, the cultural, political, and military influence of Alexander and his empire endured for centuries. The most significant and lasting impact of the Macedonian Empire was the spread of Greek culture and Hellenistic civilization across the known world. This period, known as the Hellenistic era, was defined by a fusion of Greek and Eastern cultures, a process that Alexander had initiated during his conquests. Greek language ideas and art spread throughout the territories of his empire, influencing local cultures and creating a new, shared cultural foundation for much of the Mediterranean and Near East. The spread of Greek culture and Hellenism. One of the most enduring aspects of Alexander's empire was the spread of Greek culture, which continued to shape the regions he had conquered long after his death. As Alexander founded cities such as Alexandria in Egypt and Antioch in Syria, these cities became centers of Greek influence and culture. The Hellenistic kingdoms that emerged from the Diadoches struggles maintained Greek as the language of administration, commerce, and intellectual life. Greek art, architecture, and philosophy flourished in these newly established cities. Greek ideas on politics, democracy, and governance influenced many of the local traditions in the Eastern Mediterranean and beyond. The cities Alexander founded, especially Alexandria, became magnets for scholars, scientists, and philosophers. The city became the home of the Museum of Alexandria, which housed the Great Library of Alexandria, a center for learning that attracted intellectuals from across the world. The spread of Greek thought was most notably seen in the field of philosophy, where Greek philosophers such as Aristotle, Alexander's tutor, Epicurus, and Zeno influenced a wide range of thinkers in the Hellenistic world. The Hellenistic period saw the development of Stoicism and Epicureanism, two philosophical schools that would have a profound influence on Western thought for centuries. In the field of science, Greek thinkers such as Euclid, Archimedes, and Ptolemy made groundbreaking advancements in mathematics, engineering, and astronomy, many of which were built upon the foundation laid by earlier Greek thinkers like Pythagoras and Plato. The blending of Greek scientific thought with Eastern traditions led to important developments in medicine and astronomy, further cementing Greek intellectual influence across Alexander's empire. Political and administrative legacy. Alexander's vision of a unified empire, though short-lived, was an early attempt at creating a universal system of governance that could bridge the gap between East and West. Although his empire quickly fragmented after his death, the administrative structures he put in place continued to influence the successor states. The satrapy system, where regions were governed by appointed leaders, was adopted by both the Seleucid and Ptolemaic empires. The concept of a unified empire with a centralized ruler who governed diverse peoples was also adopted by the Roman Empire, which inherited much of its political structure from the Hellenistic kingdoms that emerged from Alexander's empire. The Roman imperial system would later build on the cultural and political foundations set by Alexander, as the Romans themselves embraced Greek culture and integrated it into their own empire. Alexander's idea of cultural integration was also revolutionary. He promoted the fusion of Greek and local customs in the regions he conquered, encouraging marriages between Greeks and locals and employing native officials alongside Greek soldiers and administrators. His efforts to blend cultures were meant to create a lasting unity within his empire, and while his empire did not survive intact, his policies left a profound influence on the way empires would govern diverse territories in the future. The cultural fusion and Hellenistic kingdoms. The Hellenistic kingdoms that followed Alexander's empire, namely the Ptolemaic kingdom of Egypt, the Seleucid Empire, and the Antigonid kingdom of Macedon, served as cultural melting pots where Greek traditions mingled with local practices. In cities like Alexandria, Greek and Egyptian cultures blended, creating a unique cultural environment that influenced everything from religion to art to daily life. In the Seleucid Empire, Greek and Persian traditions were combined, and cities like Seleucia and Antioch became centers of Greek culture in the East. These cities not only served as administrative centers, but also as vibrant hubs of intellectual, artistic, and cultural exchange. The Seleucid Empire, despite its internal struggles and eventual collapse, helped spread Hellenistic culture deep into Central Asia and India, where Greek ideas influenced local civilizations, such as the Greco-Bactrian kingdom and the Indo-Greek kingdom. In Egypt, the Ptolemaic dynasty embraced Greek culture, while also maintaining the ancient Egyptian traditions. The founding of Alexandria as a Greek city in the heart of Egypt was a monumental act of cultural fusion. The Ptolemies ruled Egypt with an eye toward maintaining Greek influence while integrating Egyptian religion and customs. Alexandria became a center of learning and a symbol of the blending of Greek and Egyptian culture. The Alexandrian school of thought, which brought together Greek philosophy and Egyptian wisdom, created a lasting intellectual legacy. The Roman legacy and the influence of Hellenism. While the Hellenistic kingdoms eventually fell to Roman expansion, the influence of Greek culture continued to permeate the Roman Empire. The Romans, who had initially been wary of Greek influence, came to admire Greek philosophy, art, and literature. Roman emperors and elites adopted Greek ideas, and Greek was spoken widely in Roman intellectual circles. The Romans would go on to conquer the lands once controlled by the Hellenistic kingdoms, but they inherited many of the cultural practices and administrative techniques that had been established by Alexander and his successors. The Roman adoption of Greek culture played a significant role in shaping Roman art, architecture, and philosophy, which would have a profound influence on Western civilization for centuries to come. Legacy in the East and the spread of Hellenistic culture. In the East, Alexander's legacy lived on in the Hellenistic kingdoms he had established, even as they declined and fell to the rising power of Rome. The Indo-Greek kingdoms in India and the Greco-Bactrian kingdoms in Central Asia kept Greek culture alive long after Alexander's death. The blending of Greek and local cultures in these regions created unique art coinage and religious practices that reflected the intermingling of East and West. The spread of Greek language and ideas across these regions continued to influence local traditions, particularly in Buddhism, where Greek-style art played a major role in the depiction of the Buddha. Even in the Middle East, where Alexander's empire once stretched, his legacy lived on in the form of Greek-speaking communities and a continued reverence for Hellenistic philosophy and science. Alexander's enduring symbolism. The figure of Alexander the Great became a symbol of power, ambition, and vision for rulers throughout history. In the centuries following his death, many military leaders sought to emulate his achievements. Napoleon Bonaparte, for example, admired Alexander as a model of military strategy and imperial ambition, and he saw himself as the heir to Alexander's legacy. The desire to conquer and unite vast territories under one ruler, as Alexander had done, became a defining goal for many empires that followed. Alexander's image, both as a conqueror and as a cultural icon, transcended time and geography. His legacy lived on not only through the empires and kingdoms that followed, but also in the myths and legends that emerged around his figure. In many cultures, Alexander was remembered as a hero who sought to unite the world, bringing both Greek culture and the traditions of the East into a single unified vision. The Macedonian Empire's place in history. The rise and fall of the Macedonian Empire under Alexander the Great is one of the most extraordinary stories in world history. Despite its short duration, Alexander's conquests left a profound impact on the ancient world, influencing everything from culture to politics to the very structure of empires. His vision of a world united under one ruler, his ability to blend East and West, and his legacy of Hellenism reshaped the ancient world in ways that would endure for centuries. Though Alexander's empire did not survive his death, his achievements continue to resonate throughout history. The spread of Greek ideas, the founding of cities, and the blending of cultures created a world that was more interconnected than ever before. Alexander's empire may have been short-lived, but its impact laid the foundation for the future of the Mediterranean world and the Western civilization that would follow. Through his conquests, Alexander the Great created an empire that was more than just a political entity. It was a cultural and intellectual force that left an enduring legacy for the ages. The Macedonian Empire, in its brief but brilliant existence, stands as a testament to the vision, ambition, and genius of Alexander the Great, one of the most remarkable figures in history. The end of Alexander's empire marked the end of an era, but the world he shaped would continue to evolve, influenced by his conquests, his ideas, and his vision of a unified world.